if Bashar al-Assad falls, that does not inherently make Syria a better place.
Right. No, right.
Nature abhors a vacuum.
It has the opportunity to become a better place.
I absolutely want to be wrong. I want things to work out.
The biggest bloc right now is a faction called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Henceforth, referred to as HTS.
Sounds like a South Korean boy band.
That's right.
A faction like HTS is going to, by its nature, be a decentralized coalition.
Right.
So if you have a whole group of people that split off from Al-Qaeda and the leadership has moderated slightly,
Yeah.
that does not mean every single member is going to have moderated.
Islam will continue to be triumphant until there have been 12 Khulafa, all of them from Al-Quraysh.
The God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever.
This is my brother, my executor, and my successor among you, so listen to him and obey.
My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting.
Whoso obeys me obeys God. Whoever disobeys me disobeys God. Whoever disobeys my commander disobeys me.
The Lord said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession.
Two systems of government, two visions for life on earth. Whichever is true changes everything. This is Christ and Khulafa.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Christ and Caliphate. So we are here today to talk about Syria, and well, Aleppo has been taken over by Syrian rebels, and so we're just going to talk about who these rebels are, what's going on in Syria, how this relates to the government and the people there, and maybe what we can expect to talk about as these events develop.
Yeah, so we are hoping this is going to be the first in a number of episodes we do where we don't just talk among ourselves, but we're hoping to talk to several people who represent the worldviews of modern Syria to some extent as well. I don't know if we're going to get everybody to be able to talk about this for reasons which I think will become obvious as we have a longer conversation about this, but there's a lot to talk about here.
There is. You know, anytime there's a war in the Middle East, there's always a lot to talk about, right? Like it's not something that it's easily ignored. You have to pay attention to what's going on in the Middle East because, like it or not, it affects your lives. You know, here in the cushy United States.
Yeah, and this one, and we've covered a lot of these things, and this is maybe the most complicated one I've actually looked into.
Really?
Yes. So to describe modern Syria, imagine if America was ruled by Mormons.
Okay.
So
you don't have to imagine. You could just go to Utah.
Yeah, you go to Utah, but imagine that you had a Mormon elite in America that was at the top of every government institution, and then you had a high-ranking Mormon at the head of government.
Okay.
The reason I say that, and this is something I only learned this week, is that Bashar al-Assad is part of the Alawite community. And the Alawite community sometimes kind of gets looped in with Shia Islam. And the Ayatollah of Iran has officially recognized it as a branch of Shia Islam, which seems to be more of a political convenience than actually anything to do with the ideology.
Mm-hmm.
But, and this is why it's so comparable to Mormonism, it's really, really hard to pin down what they actually believe and if everybody in that sect actually believes it.
If they can agree altogether.
So at least some Alawites believe that Ali is actually the physical incarnation of Allah.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's pretty groundbreaking.
It is pretty groundbreaking, but I've always had the basic unpopular opinion is that what Islam does is kind of delete Jesus. And I don't mean Muslims make no reference to Jesus. I mean that they delete the biblical traits of Jesus. And what Shia Islam is kind of trying to do is replace Jesus with Ali and his descendants, especially through Hussein and Karbala and something. And the Alawites have just kind of completed that process. And they literally believe Ali is a physical manifestation of God. Some of them do. But it's really, really complicated.
That's fascinating. We should totally do an episode on that someday.
Yeah, I want to. I need to get some more primary sources.
Sure.
Because there's not many sources available in English. There's a lot of conversations on Reddit and X about this.
Right.
So there's a lot of conjecture out there. And there's some people who are Alawites who are speaking and some people who are quoting sources, and there's disagreement there. But one thing that's pretty consistent is that the Alawite religion is secretive in that they are sort of sworn to secrecy about some of their deepest doctrines and aren't supposed to tell outsiders this, which in modern Mormonism is the same.
I see.
In modern Mormonism,
Right.
the official doctrine of the church is still that God was once a man in another multiverse or planet or however they frame it these days, and you can become a god one day if you properly follow the precepts of Mormonism. Mormons still believe that, but the average Mormon on the street is more likely than ever to actually be disconnected from that and just to think he's like an evangelical Christian who happens to believe that Joseph Smith is also a prophet, kind of thing. And I think that's roughly equivalent with the Alawites in Syria as well.
I think the more and more you become a religious minority, the more and more you're aware of its tenets, right? So it would seem to me that if you were an Alawite, and you were being governed by Alawites, right? Like, and you were, part of that community, that you would be, at least somewhat aware, right? Like, I think it's easier to be like I don't know, like a disconnected Muslim, in different places in the world because their communities are so big.
Now, what I will say is some Alawites on Reddit are saying these are all rumors. This is just Ottoman propaganda about us in order to squash out our movement. And if there are any Alawites listening who feel like we're misrepresenting what they believe, I'd actually love to have an Alawite on the show. Only, however, if they can actually show me from the sources what they actually believe and point me to some sources that I can actually examine for myself rather than just taking the word of any particular podcast guest.
Is there an Arabic
Sure.
translation?
Yes. You can just send them to us in Arabic. We have someone who can read Arabic on the team.
Yeah.
And we can deal with Arabic. That's not a problem.
Great.
So that's an interesting part of this dynamic because it basically means Alawites make up 11% of Syria. Christians historically make up about 10% of Syria. And the Alawite minority is the most powerful faction in the country, which is like 75% Sunni Muslim.
Right.
Okay.
That's strange.
I guess the question that pops up in my head is Mormonism in America actually that small of a percentage?
Smaller.
It
Much,
is?
much smaller.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now in Utah,
Right.
sure, it's larger.
Right.
But
Right.
in America in general, it's a significantly smaller population than that.
Okay.
So it's a very interesting dynamic just on the face of it. And Bashar al-Assad is also a really interesting character as well. It's really like the plot to a movie. That he is the second son. He is training to be a doctor in London. Then his older brother, who is heir apparent to the dictatorship of Syria, dies. And he is then thrust into this position of being in charge of the Syrian occupation forces in Lebanon who are fighting the Palestinians in the 90s. That's another part of this.
Yeah.
And then just sort of rises through the ranks. So then in the year 2000, his dad died. The constitution is changed. So you had to be 44 to be president of Syria. And then right before Assad became president, it was moved to 34, which was his age, which is my age.
Which is your age.
That's funny. Well, he's been around a long time.
Yeah, he has been around.
Yeah.
So this happened in the year 2000. So he has been the
Right.
dictator of Syria since the year 2000.
Wow.
Coming up on 15 years. Yeah.
My whole life.
Yeah, right. That's crazy. The Assad regime is one entire Sophia old.
Well, that makes me feel old. But go ahead.
Well, okay, the Bashar al-Assad.
Old timers remember history before the year 2000. Back when we rode horses everywhere, cranked up our cars.
And it's the classic son of the dictator story where his father was a popular dictator
Sure.
who was generally well loved and had a lot of credibility in the country. But Bashar al
Dictator.
I don't know if we want to call him a good dictator, but at least he's good at being a dictator.
Good, quote unquote. Yeah.
So when Bashar came to power, he didn't have the same credibility as his father, and there were a lot of internal factions that wanted him gone, and that resulted in him having a very brutal crackdown on political rivals, and which is kind of that tool has kind of marked the rest of his reign as well. His default way of dealing with opposition is very heavy-handed crackdowns and use of the military and police apparatus, which has essentially turned Syria into a police state.
Right. So a lot of the forces that are, in rebellion are pointing to that initial crackdown. Right? Like it was like something about a pro-democracy demonstration, and then all of a sudden it turned, it also became heavy-handed.
Sure, the seeds have been there, but that really kicks off during the Arab Spring.
Right.
So during the Arab Spring, which started in Tunisia and then led to these riots and protests across the Arab world, including in Egypt and Libya, with a lot of US help there, where Muammar Gaddafi was killed and then Libya fell into anarchy. The Egyptian government was overthrown and replaced with the Muslim Brotherhood, which was then overthrown and replaced with the old Egyptian government again.
Yeah.
And then in Syria, you had lots of protests.
Yeah.
Then you had armed crackdowns on protesters, which flared everything up and led to a revolution, then a civil war.
Crazy. Yeah.
So then Bashar al-Assad was basically losing that civil war.
Yeah.
He was getting pushed back. But also you had the rise of ISIS in that time as well. It was in the chaos from the Syrian Revolution in 2012 that led to the rise of ISIS, where they bulldozed the border between Iraq and Syria, and they declared an Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Islamic State, IS, of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. But what that meant for Assad is that a lot of the people that would have been fighting him actually ended up fighting ISIS.
Right.
Because ISIS was seen as this massive evil existential threat that it basically united everyone that was not ISIS into fighting ISIS, basically.
Bigger, yeah.
So it was kind of the more, it's like, the X-Men fighting Magneto, then Apocalypse shows up, right?
Right. I can neither confirm nor deny that at one point, I don't know if I should tell this story.
No, tell it. You gotta.
Okay.
We can edit it out. It's too.
Yeah, you can edit it out. I was on a tour in Israel, and this particular tour company had connections with the IDF, which was weird because I did not expect that to happen when I signed up for the tour. But we went to a military installation on top of Mount Hermon, and we're looking down essentially into this valley that was Syria, and just over the mountains on the other side they said, well, that's Damascus, and in the valley you could see like the warfare going on. You could see, like, this is about 2016, you know, and they were like, it's Druze, you know, who are loyal to Assad, fighting Al Qaeda and you know, ISIS fighting Al Qaeda, and it's just all these different factions duking it out in this valley. So yeah, I mean, you know, you'd be sitting there, and some people stayed on the bus, you know, and they were like, I was asleep and I woke up because there was shelling. You know, no,
Oh,
yeah,
people.
I that didn't like you could like catch it because it was off in the distance, but you were so high up, you know, like you were just kind of you couldn't actually like I didn't have like a telescope or anything
Yeah.
like that. So whether or not this stays in the episode, you know, the point is that 2016 was not yesterday, and
Right.
these things have been going on for a while. And what you're talking about, right? Like factional warfare, right? Factions trying to get control of this area has been going on for quite some time. And, you know, watching the combat, um, I mean, you know, it's not like I was on the ground with a, you
No.
know, like as a journalist or something.
Safely over.
Totally safe. You know what I mean? Like, you know, the like looking down on it, um, you know, was crazy, right? It was crazy to see this.
So in this conflict, you end up having 12 million Syrians displaced, and over 5 million of those people having to have left Syria.
Yeah.
And Turkey's had a large part of that crisis. A lot of the Syrian refugees ended up in Turkey.
Yep. And they're not generally loved because you know Turkey's taken in Iraqis and Syrians and Iranians and now Afghans and everything else like that. And the Syrians, my mother tells me, this is my mother, so it's all colloquial, that you know the the non-Turks, maybe not just the Syrians, they don't want to like integrate into Turkish society. So
Oh.
Turks are very like, no, you're here, you have to be Turkish, right? These are this
gosh.
is yeah.
So because Turkey has a lot of Syrian refugees, that gives them a very direct vested interest in what happens in the future of Syria.
Yeah.
Right.
So that has led to Turkey funding several opposition groups
Yes.
in Syria. Right.
Yes.
So Erdogan's hand is very thoroughly in the pie. I don't know. I forgot how to complete that metaphor. But he's involved. Turkey is involved in Syria. Right.
Hands in the cookie jar.
Hands in the cookie jar.
Yeah. That's a good one.
Wanting against the current establishment, or wanting, or like with the I guess we haven't talked about who the rebels are
Yeah.
that came over Aleppo.
But before we talk about that, there's a couple more missing pieces.
Okay.
So Assad was on the retreat up until 2015. And then in 2015, both Russia and Iran started giving Assad very direct help in Syria. So Russian forces and mercenaries were helping push rebel positions back, helping reclaim different cities for the Syrian government, to the point that everyone is just basically blocked in on this thin strip of land in the north of the country. So the main people on the ground helping the Assad government regain power and take back the country were the Russian government, the Iranian government, which facilitated lots of Shia militias coming into the country to help, including Afghan Shia militias. But the by far the biggest ground force on the Iranian coalition was Hezbollah from Lebanon.
Right.
Whoa. They were the biggest?
Yes, because they're right next to Syria. They are powerful and armed and organized and under the hegemony of the Iranian regime.
I
Right.
see.
So
Funded, backed, trained. Yeah.
yes. So Bashar al-Assad is basically very heavily aligned with Iran and very heavily aligned with Russia. So what this has meant is that this conflict has kind of been frozen along current lines really since 2017 after the defeat of ISIS. And not there's been plenty of back and forth bombing, but all kind of like lower level stuff. Nothing
Right.
major or drastic has changed for a while.
They did sign a ceasefire in 2020. So which has been tenuous, right? but it really it didn't resolve the conflict. Like apparently the northwestern part of the country is still under control of these rebel factions, and they have set up their own kind of proxy government.
Proxy governments.
Yeah, right.
So these were all kind of. So now that's a good time to talk about who the factions actually are. So there's sort of 3 major rebel factions. There's tons of sub factions, but there's kind of like 3 main ones. So the biggest sub faction, and kind of like the main one that's backed by Turkey, would be called the Syrian National Council, which is a coalition of Muslim Brotherhood types, like the people that took over Egypt briefly. And you have also secular Syrians who want a secular government as part of that coalition. And for a long time, it had the Kurds as part of that as well.
The Kurds. Yeah.
Yeah, the Kurds are a pretty big player in this.
Right.
And is probably the most cohesive and unified sub-faction in this whole thing.
Oh.
But basically, the Kurds have distanced themselves from that coalition, because what the Kurds really want at this point is as much autonomy as they can possibly get.
Yeah.
So
right.
so they're not super excited about the group project anymore, but the chaos and the collapse is an advantage for their faction because they had been persecuted by the Syrian government, and this gives them opportunity to kind of like carve out their own piece of Kurdistan. What exactly that looks like, no one's quite sure yet, but autonomy is their main goal.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Syrian Council, the Kurds.
And then the biggest block right now is a faction called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Henceforth referred to as HTS.
HTS.
Right.
Sounds like a South Korean boy band.
That's right.
I'm like glad we don't also cover South Korean politics because that's also a mess right now. But HTS is there's like seriously like martial law in Seoul right now.
I read that. I saw that.
But anyway, back to HTS's debut tour.
That's good.
So basically, the way HTS started was actually a part of Al-Qaeda in Syria.
Okay.
So ISIS was also a branch off from Al-Qaeda in Syria, and this is a branch off from Al-Qaeda in Syria as well. What they've publicly stated is that they want to move away from Al-Qaeda's goals of doing terrorist attacks in different countries and trying to establish some sort of like global Islam, and really want to focus on bringing a sort of just Islamic society in Syria specifically. And there is some evidence that the leadership has moderated to some extent as well. So, for example, last year in their territory, they just allowed the first church services to take place.
Oh, that's interesting.
As well. So,
wow. Some
people think that they're moderating just for the sake of show, just to try and build a broader coalition.
That's what my spider sense would say.
But even if that's true,
right?
People who are able to moderate for the sense of show, for the sake of building a wider coalition, there's still a sense of pragmatism there that is a step down from the highest possible extremes.
Right.
Like usually that whole faction is, we're going to have this exactly how I want to have it, or we're going to die trying and go to Jannah.
Yep.
So even the fact that if they're trying to play politics, may show some.
No, that's a very valid point. I mean, it's not like there are factions within, say, like the Taliban that are trying to be, at least play the game, right? Like it's our way or the highway, or even at the beginning of the Iranian Revolution, right? Like, Iran has progressed as a society since then, but it's always had this kind of hardline leadership that I think they've moved the needle a little bit more, towards like allowing some things, but it's not like the Taliban right now are allowing people to, even dress like Western. So yeah, it's an encouraging thing.
Yeah. However, there's also some worrying things that are coming out of this as well. Like, there's some videos that have emerged of HTS members putting Kurdish women in the back of trucks to sell them into slavery, allegedly. Right? I've been seeing some of that on X right now.
Right.
I thought they were working together.
Well, here is the thing though.
Or are they all just struggling to be the person that comes?
A bit of both, right? Because a faction like HTS is going to, by its nature, be a decentralized coalition.
Right.
So some of what you're going to see is going to be the position of the central leadership, and you have other groups within that. So if you have a whole group of people that split off from Al Qaeda, and the leadership has moderated slightly,
yeah,
that does not mean every single member is going to have moderated.
My question, that was like kind of what I was thinking. Yeah.
So
I was like, how did they decide, and how did they like organize, and how did how did they count off everybody and then like, send them?
Well, I mean, even the idea of a Syrian National Council, right? That doesn't scream of a very centralized thing either, right? It's a council of people coming together and trying to figure out what to do, as opposed to, oh, here's a dynamic form of government, right?
Okay.
Like, it's one might be more tightly knit than the other, but I just, knowing what you know about that region and how different factions operate, it's usually by the sword, right? I mean, meaning not the literal sword, but by force, right? Like we have coalitions are hammered together by force. The strongest one wins.
Yes. And with one faction, you have Turkey trying to be that voice of force, basically.
Right.
But you're saying Turkey just doesn't want Syrian refugees in their country?
No.
I think it's much more than that.
I think
I was gonna say that seems way
I think,
too...
it's easy to look at what like Turkey's
Simple.
doing and say they have always had uh enmity with Kurdish people, right? Like they're, they view the PKK as a terrorist group. Have had, I guess, terrorist attacks happen in Turkey at the hands of the PKK, and a lot of the things that they try to do militarily are against Kurds. So if you were Turkey in this situation, I could see a path where you would be like, this is our opportunity to kind of establish our borders a little bit further out, or at least have proxy states that are, you know what I mean? That are like that, like, hey, maybe not. I think like saying maybe we want our own Hezbollah, right? Is not, it might not be the best wording, but it's the same idea, right? It's the idea that, they want their own group that operates as a proxy in this kind of really chaotic area that acts in their interests. And, there's evidence that that group, the Turkish-backed rebels, have fought in different places, like in Libya, right? Like have been sent into different, conflicts by Turkey, right? But not by Turkey. See what I'm saying? Like as a proxy group, its fighters wind up in different places. So
right now, there was a golden opportunity for all the rebel factions essentially to cooperate on taking Aleppo.
Yeah.
Right.
And the reason for this is the thing that was propping up the Assad regime was the Russian government, the Iranian government, and Hezbollah.
Uh-huh.
And right now, Russia is very tied up in Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
Hezbollah's military capability has been basically decimated by in Lebanon by Israel, and they're still kind of regrouping. And the Iranian machine is all kind of focused on potential conflict with Israel
Right.
itself, which means that the
Huh.
power of Assad has loosened to the extent that the rebels saw their moment
Oh wow.
and took it. And Aleppo fell really quickly. It was really within
It's verified, right? That the
yes,
whole city is under their control.
the whole city. The government
Okay,
forces the government forces have now retreated. The Kurds have forces in a Kurdish neighborhood protecting the Kurds.
hmm
But other than that, it's all under the
So they did it. Groups. I wonder if you said these are the three main, but there is more. There's
yeah,
other more groups.
and there's sub factions within those
Okay,
factions.
so factions. And so they did it, and now it's gonna be like, who gets what, and it's like now they're gonna fight amongst each other.
Maybe we'll see. I think,
Or I don't know. I guess they could get super organized.
they could, and I think while
Although by the sound of it, Kurdish women being kidnapped and sold into, that doesn't sound
Well, yeah,
too
those
promising.
prejudices are not going to go away, right?
Yeah.
You know, the underlying faction is the reason why they're not all unified is that they don't believe the same thing, and a lot of them aren't from the same places.
Okay.
So it's going to be really difficult for a Kurdish woman, for instance, to feel protected around a coalition like that. You see what I'm
It's
saying?
scary. I feel
Yeah.
really awful.
Yeah.
for
And those
the people.
those whole areas like Aleppo has been devastated like before, in the early part of the war, right? Like when it was at its highest. I got to sit in on a presentation about a missionary group that was smuggling ultrasound equipment into hospitals underground so that women could give birth, right? Because all of it had been destroyed.
Mm.
The hospitals had been destroyed, everything had been destroyed. And, they would have to operate in such secret because they knew that if they were exposed, whatever faction was above them would just come in and shut the operation down, maybe kill them, definitely take all the equipment, all that other stuff for themselves. So, it's always like the average, person, right?
Yeah. I'm like, who?
Who's like, kind of like, I don't know, casually disregarded, I guess.
Yeah.
There's no, I'm reading these articles now. They're talking about the conflict in Syria and they're saying, oh, well, they bombed the hospital, right? Or, oh, they bombed the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
But on the down low, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these groups set up camp in neighborhoods and hospitals, right? That's where they're embedded. They're embedded in these neighborhoods and these hospitals.
Sure.
It's not like they have Fort Aleppo. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's not like they have, Fort HTS and let's just bomb each other from there. You know what I mean? This is urban warfare in a very small country, right? Like that, has a lot of different like strategic places where you can launch attacks from.
Yeah.
So what you do is you engage in guerrilla warfare, right? You embed yourself in a population. So when these Russian, warplanes come through, right? It's a lot what's like, very similar to what happened in Gaza.
right.
It's the same principle. It's just now the Russians are doing it.
Because I'm curious what Damascus is. I don't know. I have to read.
I mean, biblically speaking, it's actually really interesting because being, at that observation point on Mount Hermon, you're like, what happens when, biblically speaking, Damascus is destroyed? Because it says that Damascus will be destroyed, right? And you're wondering, like, is that a nuke? Is that what would do that? And looking at that valley and wondering where the fallout goes, there's just people in there. It's just people. It's farms, from where I could see, right? Like open country. But when you go further out, I mean, there's an old city there, right? With a lot of people in it.
Yeah.
So, it's unfortunate that, regardless of whatever the factions are and how they're fighting back and forth and who wants control and everything else like that, that there's, this people who have been at war for, the better part of 15 years,
Well, yeah, yeah. 'Cause
right?
there's like what percentage? I don't know what exact percentage might be refugees of the Syrian population.
It's massive. I
it's
don't know the
huge.
population. There's
Yeah.
there's 12 million people. I don't know what
Yeah.
percentage that is,
Yeah, it's
but that's a
huge.
lot of
That's huge.
refugees.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So like half are displaced within Syria, and the other half are displaced
Mhm.
outside of Syria.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to say, I think, Bashar al-Assad is unquestionably a dictator.
Yeah,
Oh.
right.
And the thing with
A
dictatorship,
dictator who's friends with other dictators,
yes,
right? So his supporters are dictators as well.
yes.
Yes.
And I think it's important to state that, I will talk to plenty of Syrians who love Bashar al-Assad, and anytime I meet people who are from dictatorships, including people from Iraq that grew up in Saddam Hussein's era, dictatorships end up working very well for some people
Yep.
and very badly for other people.
Other people. Yep.
And so, in general, when I talk to Christians from Syria, they've had a generally good experience in Assad's Syria because they weren't really ever his target.
Right.
Mm.
And so it's important to understand that his reign hasn't been unmitigated evil for everybody, but he certainly caused a lot of people to lose their civil liberties and be in jail and die.
And die.
Yeah,
Right.
and he's been
Yeah.
a genuine
Run for their lives.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
he's been a genuine dictator. I think what makes me nervous with any revolution like the one that's happening now is if Bashar al-Assad falls, that does not inherently make Syria a better place.
Right. No. Right.
Nature abhors a vacuum.
Right. Right.
Yes. Now, it has the opportunity to become a better place, but that's not inherently going to happen.
No. Yeah. Like the question is, if he falls, is everything just gonna get worse?
I mean, where I've
Are
been
more
sitting
people gonna die?
on this is, I feel like it's
Because they already are.
it's a poison pill, right? Like if you take the blue pill, you get what you have. If you take the red pill, you get what you don't know you have. But I kind of feel like both pills are really bad for you and maybe filled with radiation,
Yeah.
right? Like they're not gonna treat sickness. They cause sickness. And listen, I want to be wrong, right? I absolutely want to be wrong. I want things to work out. I'm just trying to sit there and say, like, looking at the players and looking how this is played out in other parts of the world and everything else like that. Like Iraq is a prime example, except it was the United States as the invading force, right? Like, what government is left? You know what I mean? Like what loyalty in the populace is it to that government that will keep a democratic state functioning? It didn't work in Afghanistan, right? Like we covered that in the other podcast that we do, the Al-Maida podcast, when we talked about how Afghanistan failed and Ashraf Ghani's book, Fixing Failed States, which is very ironic because the state failed, right? Like they put the guy who wrote the book on fixing the state in charge and the state failed. And, there have been other attempts to install, parliamentary style democratic governments in these countries. And, the success rate is not great.
Yeah.
Right. Or, they're successful for a time. And then, this like increasing polarization within the Islamic world, pulling it away from, what you would look at from a Western style democracy.
Yeah. Because like the fall of Kabul, I think I asked you like, oh, like what's the similarities in these two situations? I don't know. It just I imagine that I don't know. But Syria, the thing is like I don't know. Syria has so many refugees. Yeah.
I think maybe like a little bit, just a really quick difference between them is that the Taliban were more unified, right? And they had international backing. Like the
Who backed the Taliban again?
the Chinese, there was a lot of evidence that there were foreign governments kind of hedging their bets against America,
Mm-hmm.
right?
ISI.
ISI,
I
right?
see.
Different countries saying, in case the Americans leave, or if they lose or whatever, we want to be able to have our stake in, um, in this government that would replace it. So, but what you've seen more in Syria is essentially divided factions,
Mm-hmm.
right? And some of them are backed by very different people with very different goals,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And when you go on X, some people are like, it's Israel, right? Israel's destabilizing the region by funding these Syrian rebels. And then you go on X and it's like, it's America, right? America's, funding these rebels and everything else like that. But the honest truth is that these forces and these dynamics have been at play for a very long time, in particularly in Syria, but in the region, much longer.
Sure.
Right. And so Western involvement may pour fuel on the fire in the same way that Russian involvement pours fuel on the fire, or Iranian involvement pours
Right.
fuel on the fire in one direction. But
This administration, the current Biden administration, in the short time that it has left, has offered to lift sanctions against the Syrian government in exchange for them breaking diplomatic ties with Iran. So,
Okay.
yeah, it's
yeah,
crazy, right?
that is crazy.
Very crazy, but that's their political play, right? Like, we're not going to support you, but we're going to take our foot off your neck, right? Like if you do what we want. So that's always going to be looked at by outside forces, by people in the Middle East as, the US is an oppressor, or, the great Satan, the little Satan, or whatever. But you can't get away from the political dynamics of it. You know what I mean? There are other countries at work, and they
Yes.
all have their agendas, and they all want to see an outcome, and they're all trying to pick a winner.
Yes, and a small faction that's trying to deal with a bigger government is always going to accept help and money and resources
Sure.
when they have the opportunity.
Sure.
To.
Yeah.
And I believe that probably what happens in those situations is we'll take their money until we're strong enough to not need it anymore. And then we'll kick them out too, because we want what we want.
So I think
And I think that's why those factions are all divided, right? Because some might be sold out to that idea of, no, they're our friends. No. We're purists, right? Like we're fundamentalists in our very fundamentalist goals. That's how these things diverge.
So I think what concerns me about this, almost ironically, is I don't have a sense of who the sort of leader would be of Syria if the rebel factions won.
It sounds like it sounds like you're leaning like, I'd rather stick with the known evil of Assad versus like seeing what happens with these groups and who could be good. It sounds like that's what you're saying. Just like fair. It's a fair.
Well,
concern.
I my view of this is very complicated, because I think some rebels have legitimate cause and a good plan,
Mm,
and others are crazy revolutionaries.
okay.
And so one thing we have in Protestant tradition, which I think is extracted from biblical principles, is something called the doctrine of the lesser magistrates.
Say that one more time.
It's something called the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. It is not biblically correct for like an everyday average average Joe who's not part of the government to take up arms and like attack the government.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're in the government and you see somebody higher in the government than you doing something immoral, your primary responsibility is to God himself and the people you serve. And there are plenty of people in the Syrian revolution who were government officers who refused to fire at crowds of protesters.
Right.
That's the kind of person that a Christian can legitimately support in an anti-government activity.
Right.
Whether they'll win or not is a completely different question. And so I'm I'm nervous about revolutions for sure. That doesn't mean it's definitely going to be worse than the current state, but if I were to put like betting
bet.
odds, I would bet that this will probably lead to more death and destruction than if you just had Assad.
I got you. I hear you.
And that doesn't make him right.
No, he's
Doesn't make him
done.
Doesn't make him good either. But we'll see. Now, in other sense, personally, the faction I'm most like, okay, I'm actually optimistic to see what happens in this faction would be the Kurds.
Okay.
Now, this is unpopular because the general sentiment among Syrians with the Kurds right now on X is that Syria has always been a diverse place for everybody, and that's the national project we're trying to work for right now. And you people going and forming your own ethno state in the corner is detracting from our strength of having a
Diversity.
diverse national project, which we're aiming for.
These are modern.
These are modern thinkers.
Syrian thinkers.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But the Kurds already have their own infrastructure and society and stability, and so we kind of know what Kurdistan's going to look like if they manage to keep their autonomy.
But where I'm pessimistic is you can go on X right now and you can see in Tehran that they are having like massive rallies to back Assad. And, they say that they're volunteers, right?
Yeah.
Like in front of, the people signing up. So are they forced to be there? Who knows, right? Is it a dog and pony show? But the truth is, the outside players, I think, completely, deconstruct what you just said, right? So you want this, but whoever winds up taking power is going to have to fight through these destabilizing efforts, regardless. So you think that if Assad wins, right? Like, let's just say the Iranian, Russian, and Syrian, governments, current Syrian government, wins, that the outside forces that would really like to see their own, things come to pass just don't try and undo that.
Sure.
Right? By sending in their own fighters, I mean, the way World War II started was they killed a bunch of Polish soldiers, and they dressed them up in Polish. they like intentionally started a conflict. You see what I'm saying?
That's true, but if we can use Iraq as a progenitor to this conflict in some ways.
Okay, but Iraq is different because, honestly, regardless of whether or not you think that the United States was right or wrong in its invasion of Iraq, I mean, I think time has showed that it was a very flawed premise. But regardless of what anyone says, the United States, at least on its face, is not Russia, is not Iran, right? Is not Syria, because its citizens have more protections, and there's a lot more transparency. Let's be honest about that, right? Like at least right now we still have we might have a biased press, but it's still a free press.
Yes. Now, but what I'm saying though is one thing that emerged out of the situation in Iraq is a stronger, more independent Kurdish region.
Okay.
So Iraq has been super unstable. Iraq had ISIS too, right?
Right.
But one thing that did strengthen was a position of the Kurds, and that's partly because they had an organizing principle before Saddam Hussein,
right,
that basically managed to kind of survive through Saddam Hussein. And then when everything collapsed, they used that opportunity to kind of grab some more of their own autonomy. Now, Kurdish Iraq is not a separate country, but they do have significant autonomy. There's allowed them to be more stable than the rest of Iraq right now. And
That's really funny.
Have we ever done an episode on the Kurds?
yes,
Okay.
I want to try and get that same guy back
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
But that could very well happen in Syria. I'd say that
I could see it happening.
because even if you're, say, Iran or Russia or Turkey, Turkey's the least likely to go for this. But if you've got like a bunch of fighting to do to kind of get all of Syria
Bro,
under,
Turkey will never go for it.
that's true.
Let's be honest.
So but if any of the sort of
They will never go for it.
if any faction that is like not the Turkish backed faction wins the situation, there's a good sense that if they've, let's say Assad takes everything back, or let's say the sort of HTC, is that what we call them?
HTS.
HTS.
HTC is a cell phone company.
HTS, the
One is a boy band. The other one is
the militant group, not the boy band. Let's say they are able to take a bunch of territory. If you have this big porcupine of Kurdish region with fresh troops, equipment, money, stability, that's saying, hey, we want our autonomy, there's a good chance that at the end of the fighting, people are going to be like, okay, let's work something out.
Sure.
Even if Assad
Sure.
takes everything back, right?
Sure.
No
doubt.
They're in a good position to negotiate because they're
Look, if Shias in Iran can make friends with Sunnis in Lebanon and create anything's possible.
yeah. So anything's possible at this point, but we'll see where it goes.
It really depends on what happens with Russia and Ukraine, Israel, and
Sure. They're that's the underpinning. I think because this has been a long episode, we could do another one on like how Christians should view the thing on it, or we could do it now.
Yeah, no, let's come back to that, especially as things develop a little bit.
Right, because I mean, right now it's fresh,
Yeah, it's very fresh. Everything's still developing, but basically, I think we've done a pretty good job summarizing what the chaos is. And we're going to keep talking about this. We're going to talk to people who are both pro-rebel, hopefully some Kurds, and maybe someone from the sort of pro-Syrian government perspective.
Maybe all together.
That would be fun.
Around this table.
That'd be chaotic, but I'd do it.
On the Almeida News Network.
Yeah.
I'd love to see that though.
Yeah, I'd love to see that too. But for now, I think there's a whole number of possibilities of what could happen in Syria. I'd caution anybody getting too excited about any of it.
Right.
Because
it's a long game.
Whatever happens next is probably going to be on the side of a lot of death.
Yeah.
And we never want to celebrate something like that.
Right.
So let's be praying for Syria.
Yep.
And I think as Christians, especially Christians who have any kind of influence in the government, what we should be thinking of in terms of foreign policy is things that benefit Syria for the sake of the Syrian people, not just for the short-term sake of one interest or another. And we're commanded to love our neighbors, we're commanded to love foreigners, we're commanded to love our enemies. So whatever we're working towards in the world should be for the good of all of Syria. No one knows what those answers are right now because it's changing every day, but that's the disposition we should have. We should want to see a healthy, prosperous Syria that's ultimately at peace.
Yes, agreed.
Well, guys, thank you for listening to Christ and Caliphate. We will be back next time.